Okay, so welcome to a new video, and this is going to be a quick one. And basically I'm just going to show you the sharpening jigs that I use and I'd recommend for you if you're looking for a sharpening jig. Now there's three sharpening jigs I use, and it's basically because I have three kind of main types of blade that I sharpen with them. First up is your standard sort of Stanley blade, bench plane. This is a block plane blade, but they're all sort of similar in that they have parallel sides, quite precisely ground to be parallel. It's consistent thickness from the edge up to the back here, and everything's kind of flat and even. It's all machined nice and even, so it's a very easy blade to clamp. Second type of blade is chisels. Now I use both Western and Japanese chisels. This is a Japanese one, but chisels, Western chisels, they are kind of similar to your bench planes in that they have parallel ground sides, and usually the top is nice and even and flat, although it's not a consistent thickness from the front to the back, but that doesn't really matter, because as long as the top is kind of flat, it's a relatively easy tool to clamp. Now Japanese chisels, they are, because they're handmade and hand ground for the most part, these two sides are usually not parallel and they're usually not straight. Also, this top area here is also not guaranteed to be flat, straight, or even kind of, in this kind of orientation. They're just all over the place. Also, they're sometimes concave, so this provides all sorts of problems for your traditional Western style sharpening jigs. Now, third type of blade is Japanese planes, and these need a completely special guide for these, because these are tapered along their length here, tapered in thickness from the edge up to the back, and these are again handmade. The back here is also quite uneven, some of them, and these really don't clamp up well in Western jigs. So these are the three kind of types of blade, and there's three types of jig. Now, sharpening jigs usually get a pretty bad rap from people because they're kind of seen as a cheater's way of sharpening. I don't really agree with that, because I think sharpening jigs are actually essential to anyone's toolkit. Reason being, one, if you're a beginner, you really want a sharpening jig to let you sharpen up a blade to the absolute best it can be. If you start off with hand sharpening, you won't have a reference for what sharp is, and often it will seem sharp, but it's not really as sharp as you would want, basically. With a sharpening jig, you can take the sort of skill factor out of it, and as long as you have good stones, you'll be able to get a very, very sharp blade, and that will give you a good taster of what sharp should be. Now, if you're a sort of a veteran kind of user, now I still recommend you have some jigs, because once your blade is sharpened up by hand a few times, invariably the bevel that you set out in the beginning will drift, either being too steep or too shallow, depending on what your sharpening sort of habits are. Now, when that happens, it's always good to have a jig so that you can set it back to the ideal bevel angle every now and then. If you try to do it by hand, it's almost impossible to hit that kind of ideal angle. Usually I sharpen up to 30 degrees for most of my blades, sometimes 25 for the sort of pairing type blades, etc. But to get those angles perfect purely by hand is basically impossible. Now, with a jig, the other thing that's good is that if you nick an edge, or you take a big chip out of an edge, you can also take that easily, grind that back easily with a jig. If you do it by hand, again, you won't be able to keep that angle consistent, and it'll take much more effort, and your results won't be as good as if you're using a jig. Using a jig, you just clamp up your blade and basically turn off your brain and go into autopilot mode and just grind away all the way past that chip, and you'll be good to go again. So I think jigs are, you really want a jig, even if you don't sharpen with jigs all the time, for those points I've mentioned. Now, onto the actual jigs I use. First type is for the Stanley type blades, and a lot of you probably recognize this, but this is an Eclipse jig. This is an actual Eclipse. I bought off eBay for, it was less than £10, maybe close to £5, but these are stupidly cheap and they can be had all over the place. So I would really recommend you pick up one of these. There's copies being made in China, and Japan has a few as well, and I think they would probably work just as well. But you know, these can clamp up all sorts of blades that are sort of based on this Stanley bench pattern. They also can apparently clamp up chisels. I don't really use them for chisels, I use a different one for chisels, but these also work for chisels with this bottom groove here. So this is a really useful guide to have. Now, you know, these are really easy to operate. They provide a nice smooth sharpening experience, and they have a single wheel, so you can also put a slight radius on your blade edge if you do that. And basically these are unbeatable for the kind of the standard shaped blades, because they're so cheap and they work so well. You know, it's a no-brainer basically. If you only want one guide, and you use mainly Western tools, then I would definitely recommend this. Now, second guide I use is this. This is a Richard Kell number 1 and number 2. Now, they're exactly the same, it's just that number 1 can only handle up to a 1-inch width, number 2 can handle up to a 2-inch width. I have both because I find number 1 easier to handle because it's shorter, more compact, and this is the one I use for anything that will fit in here. Number 2 I'll use for larger chisels, so you know, this is also handy. Now I have to kind of mention a few things about these, because initially when I first bought this, I bought both of these new, and this one I've used less than 10 times definitely. And basically these rollers, they're made of something called Ertalite, which is an engineering plastic, and I think that was not really the best choice. If you can hear, it's got quite a lot of friction. You can hear a sort of a gritty sound. I've taken care to wash these out after every sharpening, etc. But this always happens, and basically it's just the grit getting stuck in there and causing all sorts of problems. And so number 1 problem is that these rollers are kind of a bit rough now after even less than 10 uses. This, by comparison, is a new one, Ertalite again. It still has a sort of scratchy sound, but it's not so bad. It's more smooth. It's still a bit rough, but this is what it's like when it's new. Now, recently, Richard has released these kind of large rollers. These are made from UHMW, which is ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, and it's basically HDPE on steroids. HDPE is high density polyethylene, and it's the stuff used in kind of those white cutting boards. Now this stuff has stupidly low friction coefficient, and it's nice and durable, and this is probably the best choice for rollers, I would imagine. Now you can hear this one. It's a lot smoother, and it just works perfectly, this one. Now, you know, this comes in a little plastic bag, some instructions and stuff, circlips here. So, you know, if you set out to buy these, I would definitely look into getting the large roller. For the number 1, it comes standard with these smaller rollers, and so I'd buy a set of these larger rollers. Number 2s now come standard with the large rollers. So, you know, if you buy number 1, I would definitely recommend upgrading. Now the problem with number 1, the other problem, is that these rollers are kind of small. It's great if you have a small blade, because you know, you don't have to push the tool too far out to clamp to 30 degrees or whatever. And that's good if you have a short blade, because obviously if you don't have much steel to clamp, it's going to be a problem. Now with a normal kind of woodworking sized tools like a chisel, plane blade, etc. So this is set to roughly about the 30-degree sort of protrusion. Now you can see there's a tiny amount of blade sticking out the end, and this huge piece of handle here, and this isn't exactly a long chisel. Actually, this is probably short in comparison to Western chisels, but you can see there's a lot of kind of unsupported weight out here, and it makes it very hard to sharpen using a push and pull stroke. Partly is that's because I think there's such a small kind of base here. This kind of distance here is just too short to provide a good stable surface, and the problem with that is that with a pull stroke it's fine, but when you start pushing it kind of tends to dig in and kind of want to tip forward, and it kind of digs into the stone and catches, and it doesn't really work very well. Now with the large rollers it allows you to kind of clamp your blade further out so that this kind of base distance is actually longer, so it provides a more stable sharpening feel. That's the only complaint I have about these guides, and once you go to the large rollers, those problems are fixed, but I think that the large rollers should have been in place from the beginning, or at least have been offered as an option. For people using tiny blades, small blades for instrument making, etc., these are the small rollers are a good thing, so I think they're a good option to have, but I would like to see UHMW for the small rollers as well. So that covers the sort of the chisel jig, the Richard Kell number 1 and 2. Now the third jig for Japanese plain blades is this guy, and this is a Grintech K2. This is basically a specialized jig purely for Japanese plain blades, and it's kind of quite a complicated beast. You have a little ruler with it. It comes with a little ruler to measure your blade dimensions, etc. And basically you set your blade width with this thing here. Set that, screw that down, put your blade in, put that in there, screw that down, and there's all these knobs and things to adjust it, and there's a whole bunch of angles here. You can maybe make out from the reflections, but there's a whole bunch of angles along here, and you can adjust the wheel along here to set the proper angle for your blade. Now this is a one-trick pony. It only works for Japanese plain blades, but it works exceptionally well. It's very stable. Again, it's one wheel, so you can actually put a slight camber, slight radius on your edge if you want, and it also provides a little wheel here, a little knob, to dial in some micro camber, micro bevel. Now, I typically don't use micro bevels, but if you do, this will provide that. And this is basically, in my opinion, the only jig that works well for Japanese plain blades. So if you do use Japanese plain blades, I would really recommend getting one of these, even though they are quite expensive. They're over 10,000 yen each, so definitely not a cheap purchase, but they will definitely kind of pay off in the long run, I think. This I've used quite a lot, and it's still rust free. The wheel is still nice and smooth, no abrasion there. You can actually get replacement wheels as well. So this is a very nice jig to have if you're using Japanese blades. Now these, apart from this one, the two I showed you earlier do not provide any adjustments for micro bevels. I don't use micro bevels. I think they're not really necessary, and they make, if you're a hand sharpener, they make your life a lot more difficult for maintaining your blade because of that micro bevel. Once you start kind of sharpening on your primary bevel and then you tilt up to do your micro bevel, that amount is really hard to judge perfectly, and so every single time you do it, you need to go a little bit higher every time to get that micro bevel in, and eventually you'll wear in a really steep bevel on here, and you'll have to regrind back down, and that's just a pain. So I really like to keep one single bevel at 30 degrees or whatever, and basically just use that as my only bevel. Now, that's why these work for me, because I don't use micro bevels. If you do use micro bevels, you'd basically have to sharpen all the way up to your finest stone, and then kind of re-clamp in the jig. But even then, it's again not very exact, because the amount you have to reclamp is a tiny amount, and it's very hard to measure consistently. So if you do use micro bevels, look for a different jig. Although I'd still recommend you use these jigs and don't use micro bevels. I do use micro bevels on some kanna, because some of them are really hard, and some of them can have a tendency to chip at the edge no matter how careful you are sharpening. So I sometimes dial in a little bit of micro bevel and go maybe about 10 strokes or less on the, like say, a 12,000 stone, my finest stone, and I create a very tiny bevel, secondary bevel, and every single time I sharpen, I will wipe out that bevel fully. So it's not substantial enough to basically cause any problems with resharpening. Now, the other problem with micro bevels is that I can't batch sharpen unless I have multiple jigs. My method of working is basically to have multiple chisels in the same size, and I'd have them all set up, and if one goes dull, I just pick up another one, keep working, pick up another one when that one goes dull, and basically keep moving through all my chisels. And at the end of the day, same for planes as well, I'd have multiple planes set up, and at the end of the day I would take them all out and sharpen them. Now that's much more efficient than waiting for one tool to go dull, going to the stones, coming back, working with it, going to the stones, etc. Batching is a lot more efficient, but because I batch, I will need multiple jigs to sharpen all these blades. Otherwise I'd have to clamp up one blade, sharpen it all the way through the grits, take it out, clamp up another blade, sharpen it all the way through the grits, etc. Whereas now what I do is I usually, because I hand sharpen, I just pick up one blade, go through one grit, and do that for all the blades, switch to another grit, go through all the blades, switch to another grit, etc., etc. And I find that much quicker, because you don't have to keep washing all the blades in between all the grits, etc., etc. You only have to do it once at the beginning of each step. So that's how I work, and that's why these guides work for me. If you use a different work method, which you probably will, I'd still recommend you have some guides, and maybe try my method as well. Or if you have a better method that you think is worthwhile, then leave a comment in the video, and let's discuss that. But yeah, these are the jigs I use, and they work great for me, and hopefully that will give you some insight on how I sharpen and how I kind of work. So thanks for watching, and hope that helped.